All right, well, hello, everyone. I am the chapter president for ATD Eastern Pennsylvania. As you know, this is our collaborative initiative between ATD Pittsburgh, ATD Philadelphia, and ATD Eastern PA for our executive education series. We host these events every month, so we're very happy that you all are able to join us today. I want to, we gotta back this up here. Introduce our speaker today. Dr. Moussa is a consultant and author and has graciously decided to join our initiative here. So without further ado, I will give him the controls of the screen, and you can run the show there. Thank you, Mario.
Great. Thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this evening, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I do hope that we could have a discussion. What we're going to be talking about tonight is culture, and I like to describe it as a puzzle, and that's the title of my forthcoming book, is The Culture Puzzle, Harnessing the Forces That Drive Your Organization's Success. So more about that in just a few moments. But what I first want to talk about is what I like to describe as my waterfront development, and this will give you a sense of where my latest work comes from. So I like to say that for about 30 years as a consultant and as a executive educator and public speaker, I've been developing these waterfront properties. And what I mean by that is I try to cover the waterfront with respect to people issues in organizations. So I think of that as communication, collaboration, and culture. And I've published books now in each of those areas. So communication, The Art of Woo, Committed Teams, Collaboration, and then the new book, The Culture Puzzle. And these are all enormously complex topics. I've been fascinated with them for a long time. But what I try to do is take the complexity and boil it down and make it simple and turn it all into a checklist. So over the years, I've developed checklists for communication and collaboration. And tonight, what I want to do is, together with you, build a checklist for culture, and think a little bit about the culture puzzle and how to put that puzzle together and manage culture in really practical ways. My thinking about the checklist goes back to, I owe a debt to Atul Gawande, and some of you might know his work. One of his books is the Checklist Manifesto, and basically his point there is professionals of all kinds use checklists to manage complexity. So engineers use them, architects use them, doctors use them. And a key point is simple reminders matter. So for example, a doctor goes into an operating room, and one of the first things they do is they check to make sure they're operating on the correct patient and correct side of the body, and so on and so forth. So the procedure might be quite complex, but it often begins by checking a few items on a list. And so I want to encourage us to think that way about our topic tonight, which is culture. And again, we're going to be building this checklist together. So I want to talk a little bit about culture, and then I'm going to ask you to think about some questions that you have about the topic, and we'll pause and we'll have a little bit of discussion here, and then Zach's going to help me keep track of the questions, and I'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So culture is puzzling because it's everywhere and everything. Lou Gerstner, the former CEO of IBM, said famously, culture is everything. But and in a way, I would agree with that, but that's part of the problem. It's everything, and then in a certain sense, because of that, it's nothing. In other words, it's really hard to pin down. So what I've tried to do is kind of bring it to our attention, and in that way make it more understandable and manageable. One of the ways I did that is I worked with a couple of colleagues, Derek Newberry and Greg Urban, and both of them are trained as cultural anthropologists. Greg is one of the leading anthropologists, cultural anthropologists in the world. And what we kind of our starting point was to treat culture as a human phenomenon, and then more specifically as an anthropological phenomenon. So, our question was, when you look at it that way through the lens of social science, what do you see? And then also we worked with a woman named Kendra Allenby, who's a cartoonist for the New Yorker, and also happens to be trained as an anthropologist. And she did illustrations for the book. And the important point there is she helped us really visualize the points that we were making. So, literally thinking in terms of visuals. So, kind of the theme of tonight, as I think of it, is okay. How do we see what's right in front of us? Because culture is everywhere and everything, sort of like the water in which a fish swims. We're not aware of it. So how do we become aware of it? And in making that point, I think of that famous quote from the novelist George Orwell. It takes a constant effort to see what's right in front of our noses. So one of the things they're going to be doing is pausing, slowing down a little bit, and becoming a bit more aware of what's in front of us. And then just a couple of other comments, and I want to pause and ask you a couple of questions. So when you think about culture or talk to others about culture, often what you see and hear is a bunch of things. Oh, it's the way we dress, it's how we talk, it's relationships, it's the way we do things around here. And all that's true, but from my perspective, those are kind of like pieces scattered, pieces of a puzzle scattered on a card table. So, what happens when you put them all together? What do you see? So we'll get to that just in a moment. But I want to pause here. And again, Zach said he'd help me out with these with the questions. So I want you to take a moment and just jot down a thought or two about how culture shows up in your work, and then I'd like you to note down a question or two that you have about culture. So like take 10, 15 seconds just to collect your thoughts, and then maybe just just write a couple of questions in chat. And then Zach, I'd like to ask you to just call out 2 or 3, and then we'll be able to answer some more questions as we proceed.
Sure.
Any questions coming through, Zach?
Not quite yet. I have imagined people are typing through now.
Anything yet?
One here, how can we establish positive culture in these more virtual environments? What is greater connectivity looks like when we seem to be more remote? I have one here that's so here we go. What is the role of leadership as role models?
Yeah.
Culture shows up in my organization in the way work gets done. How easy or difficult is it to be innovative, make change happen, or get things approved?
Okay. So Zach, let me suggest that we just pause there and just think a little bit about these questions. And then, as I said, maybe we'll have time to come back to others. So one question is, how do you in this virtual environment deal with culture? And we could talk about that a bit as we move through the topic. But one thing that I would emphasize here is culture is importantly about connection. And so human, we all need connections. Human beings are basically social. So I think, thinking about that, how do we create moments even in this virtual environment for connection? It's a little bit easy. I hear this from lots of colleagues and virtually all of the clients that I've been working with. It's easy to lose a connection with others. So I would say we need to pay a little bit more attention to connecting, and again, slow down a little bit. Another question that came up is leadership. How do you model positive behaviors? The one point that I would emphasize, and maybe we could develop this a little bit later, is listening. So when someone asks me, what can I do to build a culture and a positive culture, that's my answer. Slow down, listen to what's important to people, and then to connect to another point that came up, also listen to how they actually get their work done. What's helping, what's hindering, and how can you as a leader enable the positive aspects of what they're doing, and how do you remove some of those barriers? So I think what I would say about these early points that have come up is they anticipate a lot of the important themes and aspects of culture that I'm going to emphasize just a little bit later. So let's take the next step, and we'll build on those comments that you've made. And I want to take that next step by talking a little bit about these two folks here. This person on the left who you see ran a really big organization a little while ago. It's called Ancient Egypt. And his name is Akhenaten. And the person you see on the right might be a little bit better known than Akhenaten. Akhenaten, that's Nefertiti. So that was Akhenaten's wife. So Akhenaten ruled ancient Egypt about 3,500 years ago, and he's interesting to me for a lot of reasons. One, he was an amazing visionary. So the story goes, he was riding in a chariot, and he comes upon a valley, and he has a deserted valley, and he has a flash of inspiration. Just in the moment, he decides he's going to build a great metropolis from which he's going to rule the world. And then he also decides he's going to start essentially a new religion. So up until Akhenaten's time, pharaohs were considered to be intermediaries between the gods and the people. And Akhenaten decided that he was going to become a god. So he created the cult of the sun god and made himself a god. And so he founded this new religion. And not only that, he ushered in all kinds of changes virtually overnight. So new architectural styles, new administrative structures, a new set of laws, as well as this whole new religion. And he ruled for about 17 years, and then he died suddenly. And the interesting thing about that is virtually overnight, all of the changes that he ushered in went away. So initially, Akhenaten said, get rid of all the statues that you've been worshiping of the old gods, any of the amulets, the symbols, and so on and so forth. That I don't want to see any of that. So what the people did is they didn't actually throw all those things away. They just hid them. And he died, and then the old gods came back. And it's kind of a parable of what happens when we try to make changes all at once, when we act like a sun god, if you like. Even if we have authority and tremendous authority like Akhenaten did, using it without buy-in doesn't necessarily lead to success, and often quite the opposite. And I'd like to say that if you look around today, you might see a lot of sun gods, and I'm going to talk about a leader, Ron Johnson, whose picture you see here, who you could sort of think of as a kind of Akhenaten, a modern Akhenaten. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ron Johnson and how he led. So Ron Johnson, as many of you might remember, ran J.C. Penney, 2013, 2014. And when his hiring was announced, the stock price went through the roof. Now, J.C. Penney around that time was on the verge of bankruptcy, and everybody knew it, investors knew it. And there was a tremendous amount of excitement when Ron Johnson took over, because he had been quite successful. And I want to emphasize the fact that he had been so successful. So many attribute to him the retail strategy of Apple. So he worked with Steve Jobs. He went from there to a number of other companies and did quite well. He was clearly very smart, educated at Harvard and Stanford. So that's his background, and he comes to J.C. Penney, and the day he's hired, almost exactly on that day, he announces, "I wasn't hired to do the same thing over and over and over again. I'm going to transform this company." And he starts making changes all at once, kind of like an Akhenaten. So he rebrands the company almost immediately. It was J.C. Penney, it becomes JCP. He changes the pricing structure. He changes the retail layout. And then he also takes a number of interesting symbolic actions. One of the things that he did is he set up a huge plexiglass garbage can at the headquarters. And he said to people, throw away all of your old stuff, sales plaques, awards, and so on. And over the period of about 2 weeks, employees threw away about 9,000 pounds of paraphernalia. And the idea was to mark the change from the old culture to the new culture. So initially there was quite a bit of excitement, both externally and internally, around all these changes and Ron Johnson's. But then things began to take a turn for the worse. I mean, one of the things that happened is that it became clear that he was disconnected from his people. He brought in a lot of his colleagues from Apple, and the J.C. Penney employees referred to them as bad apples. And then on the other side, the members of his senior team referred to the old-time J.C. Penney employees as dopes, which stood for dumb old penny employees. So things weren't going so well. Revenues fell dramatically. The stock price had gone up, but then it went down. And after about a year, Ron Johnson was fired. And then, interestingly, the old CEO comes back. And my point is, you often see this when changes are introduced without the right kind of buy-in. Often there's a dramatic rollout, and then things fall apart. And so one point that I want to emphasize that came up earlier in our conversation is connection. Connection is so key when it comes to leading and managing culture. But the evidence is that that often leaders are disconnected from their people. So often it's the case, and I summarize some of my next points here on this slide. Often it's the case that employees don't understand goals, or if they understand the goals, they don't buy into those goals, or they really don't believe those goals have to do with walking the talk. So this idea of connection is key. And then I also want to mention something that Ron Johnson said, reflecting back on his experience. And we're going to build on this idea a little bit later in our discussion. So a couple of years afterwards, he was giving a talk at Harvard, and he was talking about his experience at J.C. Penney, and he says, looking back, I realized that I was situationally arrogant. In other words, he really wasn't in touch with the situation that he was in. And here's my point. Ron Johnson was enormously accomplished and enormously smart, but he was out of touch, situationally arrogant. And point that I want to make is that we all potentially, we all run the risk of being situationally arrogant when we're too focused on what we want to accomplish, and not connected to enough to what's important to the people around us, our team and the larger organization. So the way I like to put this point is we all suffer to some degree from the illusion of insight. And so I just want to explain this idea a little bit by asking you a couple of questions, and then I'm going to introduce a framework that I think helps us be more in touch with what's happening around us. But first, this illusion of insight. So my first question is, how many of you have a friend or a significant other or a spouse who you talk to from time to time? Show of hands. Okay, so good. So it looks like I always check to see if people aren't raising their hands. I get worried if people don't raise their hands. So think of a conversation that you had recently with that person who you know really well, and then ask yourself, what's the likelihood that each of you understood what the other was really thinking? And let's keep it simple. Do you think it was very likely or not so likely? So how many of you would say very likely you understood what was on each other's minds? Show of hands. Okay, how many of you say not so likely? Okay, the answer is not so likely, at least according to the research. The likelihood that each of you understood what the other was really thinking is about at the level of random guessing, if you look at the data. Now, what does that mean? What can you do to neutralize this tendency we have to make assumptions about what others are thinking or feeling? Slow down. I think the distinction that Dan Kahneman makes between fast thinking and slow thinking is critical. It's one of the best ways to neutralize this illusion of insight, to switch from fast to slow. So the point here is that we're not very good at understanding what others are thinking, what's important to them, what they're feeling, even people that we tend who are close to us or we spend a lot of time with. And then the other aspect of this that I want to emphasize has to do with our sense of how others see us. So again, let me ask you a question. How many of you like to dance? Show of hands. Okay, all right, good. We have a number of folks who like to dance. So a little story, kind of a parable that I want to share with you about dancing. A while back, my wife and I celebrated an important anniversary by going to a spa. And one day I say, let's take a dance class this afternoon. And she's overjoyed because for 30 years, she's wanted to take a dance class with me. So we go. And the teacher is this just really amazing looking. He's about literally like 5 feet tall, shaved head, about 75 years old, really flexible. And he's dressed all in shiny sequins. And I think, wow, this is going to be a fantastic class. So he starts dancing, and then I realize pretty quickly, oh, the idea here is you just mimic what he does, and that's what the class is about. So I start doing that. I'm mimicking Yuichi, and then I'm feeling fantastic. He's like a magician. Within a minute, he's made me into a fabulous dancer. And then I happen to look at the mirror, and I'm shocked because I look like a car crash victim, relearning how to walk. So my point is, I was out of touch, but with how I actually looked to others. So that's the other aspect of the illusion of insight. So we're not really so good at connecting with others, and we're not naturally or intuitively so good at understanding how others see us. So what do we need to do? Slow down and check for understanding and watch for situational arrogance. And then what I would add to that is I think it really helps to have a framework for to kind of guide your attention. So what I would suggest is the following: look for a few things when it comes to understanding culture, and I want to emphasize those few things here. I want to start with the woman you see in the upper part of the slide. That's Margaret Mead. And she's Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said that culture emerged with broken bones. And she was asked what she meant by that. And she said, well, there's evidence in the archaeological record that at a certain point, when humans broke a bone, they had the opportunity for them to heal. They survived broken bones. And what that indicated to her is that at a certain point, people started taking care of each other. And basically the point is culture is about connection. So a key point here is that you put a group of people together and a culture forms. That's wired into the basic ways we think and we feel and we problem solve. So culture is what makes us human, according to anthropologists. Now, what is it? And if you look at all people at all times, basically what they're concerned with is four things, I would suggest. One is, where are we going? So in other words, they ask questions related to vision. How do we work together? What are our plans? What do we stand for? What are our values? And then they ask who's in our group and who's not in our group. So relationships, purpose, achievement, being recognized for a job well done. Call that interest. So there's vision, interest, and then there's habit. How do we usually get things done? What's our history? What are the routines that define the way we do things around here? And then what are the rituals that kind of reinforce those habits and routines? And what I would call out here that I think is especially important in a work environment is like, how do we meet? Who talks? Who doesn't talk? How do we organize our meetings? Do we have agendas and so on? So call all of that habit. And then finally, there's innovation, which is about the question, how do we do things better? Human beings are kind of natural innovators, and you see this down through history. And I think we see this most recently in the pandemic. I don't know about you, but I've really been struck by how so many of my clients changed all at once. I mean, almost literally a year ago, they were working in the office, and then the next day they were working remotely. And we figured things out. So there's this kind of basic force of innovation that's always moving through our groups and organizations. So here's the point that I'm getting at. You put the pieces, those scattered pieces of the puzzle together, and you have these four forces of vision, interest, habit, innovation. So when you're looking to understand your culture, what I would suggest is look at ways in which the question of where we're going is defined, who's inside and outside the group, listen for answers to that question. How do we do things around here? And then ask where's the innovation happening? Who's leading that innovation? So culture emerges from the interaction of these four forces. It guides the way we think and make decisions. It's what holds us together. And then the last point that I want to make is it's always changing. Culture is not static. So one of the most important things we can do is to listen and observe and not make assumptions. And I'm just going to make a couple of other points, and then we're going to pause and have some discussion here. So in order to get work done, we form cultures. You put people together and they form a culture. So from my point of view and my colleagues' point of view, culture is what comes first. So often in organizations, culture is considered a kind of add-on. You know, at first there's operations and finance and strategy and so on. But from our perspective, really business begins with culture, because you put people together and cultures form almost immediately. So culture is a process of learning and adaptation that defines us as human beings. And that seems to be something that we do especially well, learn and adapt and pass on that learning and adaptation much better than any other animals do. So to get work done, we form cultures, and often and inevitably there are subcultures in our organizations. One of my colleagues, Gillian Tutt, who is the editor of the Financial Times, also trained as an anthropologist, wrote a book called The Silo Effect, which is about this phenomenon. Her basic point is not only is there an organizational culture, but there are subcultures. And just a very quick example here. Another of my colleagues, Rob Cross, did some work with a bank that wanted to break down the barriers or silos between the three groups: IT, consulting, business process, and then database management. And so they did what a lot of companies do when they want to drive change. They reorganize. So they made these three units into one, and they put one person in charge, and they changed job descriptions and incentives and so on and so forth. And a few months after that, Rob Cross went back to the company and did surveys and interviews, and they drew the map of the interaction. And this was the resulting map. And what does this tell you? They're still in their silos because they have different cultures. IT is different from business process, is different from database management. And when he asked them about others, they'd say, well, like the IT folks would say about the business process people, oh, they're so rigid. And then the business process would be, people would say, oh, the IT people love one-off problems. You know, you can't work with them. So these underlying cultural differences were never really addressed, and people stayed in their silos. So given all that, so I wanted to pause and ask you to think about 2 or 3 tribes in your own organization, and then I'd like you to think about maybe 1 or 2 actions that you could take to build what I like to call a tribe of tribes or a team of teams. In other words, how are those tribes defined by differing visions or differing histories or different sets of interests or different ways of solving problems? So maybe what I'd like to suggest is take just 15 seconds, collect your thoughts, and then maybe we could do some thinking together about tribes in your organization. And I'm really curious to, if this framework of vision, interest, habit, innovation helps you think about those tribes and building connections across tribes. So I'm just going to pause here so I can see you and maybe see some of the chat and see if that stimulates any thoughts on your part. So Angela, I think you were making some notes about academic departments. Could you share some thoughts?
Sure, I work at Penn State, and so we have academic departments within our colleges. So I work in the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences. We have the Department of Geography, the Department of Geosciences, Energy, Business, and Finance. But before coming over to the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences, I worked in outreach and continuing and distance education in marketing, and that we don't have any faculty there. It's just staff who work in marketing and program development and program planning and student services. So
yeah,
very, very different cultures between those two groups. Fascinating.
Yeah. And if you were to build a bridge between those cultures, thoughts about how you might do that, and in particular, thinking in terms of vision or habit or interest or innovation, thoughts along those lines?
Well, that's a tough one. When we did do projects together, the academic side always had the authority or the veto. And so I would flip that and have the staff people maybe have more authority on a team and hold the whole team accountable for specific outcomes.
So changing the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a different understanding of the rules. So I'd like to bring in a couple of others into the conversation. Karen, thoughts? So this framework, again, vision, habit, innovation, interest, thoughts about how it might be helpful in building connections across an organization or your organization?
Well, my organization is very small, so there's basically one culture. But I've worked at larger companies that had this, and I guess that's where a lot of my thoughts were formed initially. And to me, it comes down to starting at the top and an interest by upper management of how the different areas do things and how we really want it to be done.
Yeah.
And starting to making changes from there.
Yeah, I think what's tricky is I think in a sense culture does begin at the top, but on the other hand, leadership teams often exist in a bubble, and there's lots of evidence that they do. And so at least from my perspective, leadership teams are often their own culture, kind of subculture, and they don't always link up with the rest of the organization. So I find that that's something to watch for. And one of the reasons why I emphasize that culture is what happens when you put a group of people together and they naturally ask these questions about where are we going, how do we get our work done, and so on and so forth, is because while leadership team might answer those questions in one way, often it's the case that people answer those questions differently in other parts of the organization. And that's also why I like to emphasize listening. So taking the time to slow down and ask questions about how work actually gets done. Someone in the chat asked the question, how do you know what you write in a brochure about your culture is what people are actually doing or how they're actually doing their work? And what I would say is what's written in a brochure is vision, but doesn't necessarily express what people's real interests are, and it doesn't necessarily express the history of how work gets done or habits in a particular part of the organization. So, again, I would go back to the idea of slowing down, remembering the illusion of insight, being careful about situational arrogance and making assumptions, and doing the work of kind of drawing out thoughts about how work should be done or how it is done in different parts of the organization. Shelley, I see you. You turned on you became visible, so I thought maybe that indicated you wanted to say something. So thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting on the four and thinking that habit to me is one of the hardest to change. So I think senior leadership can set vision and you can plaster it all around and communicate about the vision, but then old habits seem to creep in, very confusing processes or very uncertain ways of getting projects approved. The daily habits that everybody is responsible for tend to trip us up, I think.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really good point. And Shelley, what I would emphasize is a couple of things. One, how do you meet? So what do you do when you have meetings? Think of meetings as a kind of ritual and a way to develop new habits. Maybe change up, as Angela was saying, kind of change up the rules of who talks or who makes decisions. And then I think decision making is another area to look at. How do we make decisions? Who's involved in the decisions? Who's authorized? Who has the authority to make a decision? What are the different roles? So those are two things I would take a look at when you're thinking about habits, meetings and decision making. Good. Other thoughts about subgroups or the four forces frameworks? Thoughts, questions, observations? Okay, so let me continue. So, basic point that I'm getting at, and here I want to draw your attention to one of Kendra's cartoons, is often what we see formally on an org chart, where someone was saying in a brochure, is not how we actually work day to day. And so what I'm trying to get at is how do we actually interact with each other? Who talks to whom? What are the groups or subgroups where work actually gets done? And Kendra kind of brought this out here in her annotated org chart. So there's maybe people whose history goes back to college, or they all like cat video, or some people have been with an organization for a long time or not so long. So these differences tend to cut across the formal org chart. So what I would encourage you to do is, think about the informal organization, which is often just as important, if not more important, than the formal organization. And then also, I would emphasize 2 or 3 things about building a culture, and I'd like to do that by just telling some quick stories here about these 3 leaders. The woman you see on the left is Linda Hudson, who for many years ran BAE Systems, a large defense contractor. And she was interviewed by the New York Times. She was asked, "What is leadership? How would you define leadership?" And she said, "When I think of leadership, I think of a politician. I think to be an effective leader, you have to think politically. In other words, it's not enough to have formal authority. You have to campaign for your ideas. You have to build. You have to build relationships. You have to generate momentum." So I contrast this with an Akhenaten or a Ron Johnson, who had a kind of sun god style of leadership. It's a different way of thinking about leadership. Formal authority is important, but it's only part of the mix. Another example that I find useful in thinking about building a culture is the woman in the middle. That's Carrie Lightner, who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And her leadership journey began with a tragedy. She lost a daughter to a drunk driver, and then she started the organization MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And she had a vision, but she also swept people into that vision. And when she was asked, "Okay, how do I make something happen in my era?" She would say, "Start a chapter," and she would give guidance and support for starting a chapter. But the point is, she kind of spread her authority across the movement, and she created what a Georgetown scholar calls a leaderful organization. So I would say, be leaderful. Think like a politician and be leaderful. And then the third example comes from the person you see on the right. That woman ran a really big organization called the English Empire about 500 years ago. That's Queen Elizabeth. And she was one of the most powerful people in the world, but she faced a number of challenges, one of which she was a woman. And she was acutely aware of that fact at key moments in her reign. There's a very famous speech that she gave in 1588 when she's about to send men off to war. And it's, I think, instructive to think about how she did that. So I'll just give you a highlight here. She's standing before a group of soldiers who are about to go off and fight. And she says, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman." That's how she starts. Now, why would she start that way? She's naming what she assumes is on their minds. That is, they're thinking she's not a king. So she acknowledges that. She gets that right out in the open. So she says, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king." So she's saying, okay, you might not see it, but inside I'm the leader that you need me to be, a heart of a king. And then she says, and a king of England too. And it said at that moment, the men erupted in cheers. And my point is, she thought strategically about how to connect. She thought about the barriers. She had a strategy for communicating. And she, in the end, inspired her men to take action. So I would say, how do you build a culture? Well, remember those four forces: vision, interest, habit, innovation. You look at groups down through history, as long as human beings have been human beings. They've asked questions related to those four forces, and those four forces have driven the creation and the adaptation of culture. And then I would say, think politically, be leaderful, and connect. And as we begin to wrap up here, I wanted to suggest we take a moment and evaluate our own culture. So in the book, there's a slightly longer evaluation, but here let's just do a kind of streamlined version. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what I'd like you to do is the following: answer these questions. Do people understand a clear set of values? 1 being not at all, 10 very much. Interest: do people fully engage with each other and have satisfying relationships? Scale of 1 to 10. Habit: do people follow individual habits and shared organizational routines that promote success? Again, where do you fall on that scale? And then innovation: do people think in strikingly novel ways about pressing issues? So take a moment and ask yourself, how does my organization or team do on these dimensions? And then what does that suggest for me about the work that I need to do, either as a leader or a teammate or a colleague, to strengthen my culture? I'll just give you a few seconds to collect your thoughts about that. And we'll come back to your evaluation in just a couple of moments. But to bring it all together, and again, here I want to acknowledge the work that our cartoonist and illustrator Kendra did. Here's the whole framework on one slide: vision, interest, habit, innovation. And you'll have copies of these slides. And what I'm hoping is that this framework, which is rooted in all the research that has been done about culture and what happens when a group of people come together, I'm hoping this framework will help you see a little bit better what's right in front of our eyes, but often so hard to see, because culture is everywhere around us. It's what makes us human, but it's a way to see with fresh eyes maybe what's happening in your organization and where the work needs to be done. So there's a lot here on this slide, but I want to just call out these 4 basic forces. And then when you have a little bit more time, maybe you could think about everything that's here, as well as the feedback that the evaluator has given you. And then that might guide you in conversations that you want to have when you're thinking in a political way, thinking in a leaderful way, and thinking in a way that leads you to connect with others and really understand from the inside what their experience is. So a couple of thoughts here as we begin to wrap up, and then I'm going to give you a moment to maybe share a takeaway with others in the Zoom. So culture is always with us. It's never the case that culture stops working. And I think one of the things that all of us have learned over the past year is the amazing resiliency that we have to adapt in the face of a pandemic and social unrest. And then my friends and colleagues out on the West Coast, they had layered over on top of this terrible fires. But culture never stops working and adapting and moving. It's dynamic. And the framework that I introduced tonight is designed to help you manage that process of adaptation that's always at work. So I just wanted to pause here for a moment before we wrap up. So what does the evaluation tell you about your culture? Are there one or two actions that our conversation tonight kind of stimulates you to think about things you might do more of or less of? So I'm gonna reach out here to some folks whose names I can see here, like Sarah. Could you share a thought or two about an action you might take to strengthen the culture on your team or your broader organization?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's always kind of challenging for us is that we operate as a sort of small microcosm within a larger organization, and that culture is very different to the culture that we see on our team. And then there's intermediate cultures in between. So I think one of the things that that my team could do to strengthen our own culture is by figuring out where we fit within that larger picture and how we can kind of bring the next level along and trying to incorporate some of the things that are important to us and then slowly kind of spread it from there to affect the change that we'd like to see in the organization as a whole.
Yeah, that's nice. And then Sarah, I would say, concretely, you might think about, how to create a forum where you have that discussion about the culture in your subgroup and the culture of the larger organizations. One of my clients, a bank on the West Coast, at the end of last year had a culture fair, which was very effective. So it gave folks an opportunity to talk about the work that was being done in the branches and the work that was being done in headquarters and how they could build connections between those two parts of the business. So I think it's really helpful to think, concretely in terms of those forums where people have an opportunity to share.
Great idea.
Yeah, good. How about Katie? Could you share a thought or two?
Yeah, happy to. I'm a sponsor here, so mostly just listening in. I work within a sales organization for a very rapidly changing innovative tech company. So I think from a cultural standpoint, a lot of my work and where I can influence my team and such is leveraging the history I have and helping new hires on board and get up to speed and understand some of the work we're doing. So I'm kind of coming at it from a different perspective, often working with clients who are figuring out how to drive this for their own. So part of it is leveraging our own product as we do to drive cultural, just cultural habits around learning and continuous development and connecting that to career growth. That's really what we're all about. So we talk a lot about that and bring it to life in our own work, so we can be examples for the clients that we work with. So
yeah, nice. Yeah. So I want to pick up on the point about growth. I think that is often a driver of cultural change and connecting to what's important to each person, connecting to the WIFM, what's important to each person and group can be a really positive driver for a culture. And then I want to pick up on one of the comments made in the chat. Do you feel vision can be embraced if it's dictated by leadership, or does it have to feel like a collaborative effort required to create the buy-in across the organization? So my answer would be, and I think it's probably clear by this point, culture really can't be dictated, or certain changes can be forced on others, the way Akhenaten did, the way Ron Johnson did, but those changes don't tend to have staying power. So I think much better to think in terms of working with these forces, connecting with people's vision for what's meaningful work, connecting with their basic needs for relationships and acknowledgement and purpose, honoring the history of the organization while not being stuck in that history, and then looking for parts of the organization where the innovation is naturally happening. Human beings naturally tinker and make changes it's always happening within an organization, but often we don't make enough of an effort to really find out where it's happening and learn from that. So to wrap up, I just want to make a couple of points. Let me just see here. And I want to build on that comment that was just made. Okay, good. So I think it really is important to bring folks along with you. It's not enough to have a vision, even a strong vision, a compelling vision. Buy-in is key. I always, in making that point, I like to share the story of this fellow, Lloyd Braun, who had a really, really good idea. It's the television show Lost. Maybe some of you remember that show. It's one of the most successful shows in television history. So Lloyd Braun had this idea. He had it when he was on vacation, and in Hawaii. He went back to work and he talked to his team about it. He said, we're going to put this idea into production. And he gave them a big budget, $13 million. No one had ever spent that much money on a TV show in the whole history of the medium. His team was a little nervous because he was basically decided that this idea was going to go forward by fiat. So they went off, they did their work. A couple months later, they came back and we said, we don't sense a lot of buy-in for your vision. Maybe we should slow down and listen to what others are saying. He said, no, this is going to be fantastic. Just go off and do it. So they continue their work. The show debuts. It's the biggest hit in television history. Now, what happened to Lloyd Braun? He was fired. He was fired 2 days before the show debuted, and he never got his job back. So the point is that he had a great idea, but people just weren't connected to him, and they weren't really connected to kind of his passion, and so he was gone. And the point is, it's not enough to have a really good idea. You need to sweep others in. You need to be leaderful in building a culture. So what I'm hoping is tonight's discussion gave you the opportunity to think about one or two things that you might add to your checklist when it comes to culture building. I would emphasize those 4 forces of vision, interest, habit, and innovation. It's a way of, again, of slowing down. Thinking about that framework is a way of slowing down, seeing what's right in front of our eyes. And what I would encourage you to do is stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter feed where I'm engaging in an ongoing dialogue with folks around culture. I don't charge by the post or anything like that. So I would really love to hear your stories about culture and your observation. And with that, I want to say thank you, and over to Zach.
Great. Well, I think it's worth mentioning also, Dr. Moussa has a book coming out this coming June. Maybe if you want to just share a little bit more about when you expect that to be out, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, the book appears June 15th, and thanks for asking, Zach. It should be available for pre-order about a month before that, and I'll be talking about it on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Yeah, with any luck, we'll have Dr. Moussa back to share a bit more in July after the book comes out. But just to kind of wrap us up here, I do want to share with you all our next Executive Education Series session will be on March 10th, and that'll be presented by Dr. Michael Platt. He's currently the director of Wharton's Neuroscience Initiative. So we do hope you join us for that. And finally, in terms of your local chapters, if you're not a member of one of your local chapters, I certainly hope and encourage you to join. There's a lot of great stuff going on in terms of what's going on for the Eastern Pennsylvania chapter. There's a session next week regarding professional development for instructional designers, and it does provide ATD continued education credits. Tomorrow, Philadelphia has Learning and Organizational Development SIG on some fantastic lessons from the employee experience within the hospitality industry. And then the day after that, Pittsburgh's running a really great session on time management. So I encourage you to join the chapter. I encourage you to attend some of these sessions. You're going to have the opportunity to get some great professional development and education opportunities from your local chapter. That being said, I appreciate you all for attending today, and I want to let you know that these slides and recording of this session will be made available to each and every chapter. So reach out to your leadership if you'd like a copy of this. And again, please follow Dr. Moussa on Twitter and reach out to him via LinkedIn. I think he's contributed fantastically today, and we thank you very much for supporting us.
Thanks so much, Zach, and thanks everybody.